Hello, this is Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
Good evening. Today we are wrapping up our series on contemporary Nigerian fiction. For this series, we read Akwaeke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, and Ayobami Adebayo's Stay With Me. If this is your first time listening to us, you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. The link is in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. And if you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's in the episode description as well. Next week, we will begin our new climate fiction series, Apocalypse Soon. We are starting with a review of A Children's Bible by Lydia Millet. But before we get to climate fiction, we should talk about Nigerian fiction. So Adichie has been described by some as the fairy godmother of Nigerian fiction. Do you see her influence on Emezi and Adebayo?
I would say not so much on Emezi. I think that their public falling out is noticeable. It shows you a difference in sensibility and a difference in kind of their worldview. There may be more of an influence on Adebayo, but I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, I don't know. There's definitely a more generalized creative fiction mode, but strict style, I don't know if we can say that for sure.
Yeah, I see what you mean with the general creative writing mode. All three books kind of feel like someone who's either gone through a program, a creative writing program, or has gone through various residencies and have studied with other writers.
I mean, they've all studied in the US, but they've also all done this workshop with Adichie. I'm wondering if it's really Adichie or if it's just their studying in the US that has influenced them more.
I do think, though, that it's not a coincidence that these stories all focus on middle class to upper middle class concerns. I think that even though Adichie is not very influential as a stylist, she is influential in that she helped redefine what people think of when they think of Nigeria. This is something that, Sam, you brought up in our episode on Americana, where she had that TED Talk and she talked about the problems of a single story. I think all three writers are doing the same thing in that they're trying to redefine the story of Nigeria. And I also think that her success as a writer definitely made it easier for other female Nigerian writers to be published in America, because publishers have seen how successful she is. And the way that publishing and entertainment works is when they see a certain kind of person or writer become successful, they start looking for other people and writers.
In sort of a similar vein, I think at the beginning of the series, I noticed that what kind of united this new wave of Nigerian writers is an aim to tell personal stories that were important to them in their own lives. And I think I've seen that in all three novels. There is definitely a focus on the importance of the narrative to the individual. And I think that this aim to tell personal stories, it moves in tandem with a desire to be recognized as members of a global middle class. I think this is especially true of Americana. And as I had mentioned in the discussion, I think Adichie is really nationalistic in a sense that she's offering Ifemelu and Obinze as kind of role models for the Nigerian population. These are the sorts of people that she wants in Nigeria. I also see it, though, in Stay With Me, and to a lesser extent, but I think it's still there, I see it in The Death of Vivek Oji. Even though Emezi does have some radical politics, I think that it is fundamentally a middle-class novel.
One of the ways we see that is how there are riots and protests in all three books, but they are not central things. They are all background noise.
Well, kind of as a general question, though, isn't all literature middle class or upper middle class? Even from the very beginning of fiction, the writers were middle class, right? Like,
Sure.
until now, I feel like almost all fiction is middle class.
I don't know. I'd say books in general can be accessible for everyone, but literature does seem to have a higher bar. That does seem more middle class.
Yeah, not just accessible, but that it comes from people who are middle class.
Would it make a difference to you if we were talking not about maybe membership in a group, but rather a sensibility or a desire, a motivation to write? Because I think with all three of these novelists, what we see is an appetite for stability rather than a sense of desperation. There is no desire for change at all costs. There's desire for certain types of aspirational change, but I think that these are people who have something to lose. And because of that, they have this kind of sensibility where they're very careful and measured. We don't have books here in this series like the example that comes to mind is like Abby's The Monkey Wrench Gang, or, kind of like any sort of anarchist Bible. We're not advocating for serious political change. We're not advocating for violence. We're not advocating for anything extreme. We are just saying, measured steps are appropriate. And I think that that's not something that I disagree with, but I think it's just notable to me, at least, how this seems to tie in with the fact that these are writers who are coming from a country that people have thought of in a very different way for a long time.
Yeah, I see the same, and I see a similar trend in Chinese writers, because we've all lived in China for a long time and we've read Chinese fiction, not recently, but maybe like half a year ago. I see that in countries that are becoming more wealthy, where this kind of wealth is portrayed in a certain way, where the, there's nothing very shameful about wealth, that it is good to become successful and wealthy, to enter the middle class and upper middle class, whereas in American fiction, there's more of a sense of guilt. There's more baggage that comes with it.
Do we lose something from literature when we lose that radicality?
But it's not lost, is it? I mean, it's just not present in these three writers from this country, but it's not lost in world literature in general, I'd say. Do you think it is?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about books that seek a certain kind of stability, then in essence, you're saying we're moving away from radical change, right?
Yeah, I'm saying that in the books that we see here, but I don't think all books are seeking that kind of stability. So are you saying, like, should we look for, or is something lost by having Nigerian literature be defined by these three books that all have this kind of celebration of the middle class?
I was trying to bring it more global, not focusing on Nigeria specifically. I don't want to say that based on what we see here that they're missing something. I don't think that's fair. I just mean if there is a global sensibility of stability once literature, either of a region or of a certain type, once it gets to this middle class sensibility.
Well, let's be more clear about what would be missing, because I think we've been focusing on, very broad political concerns, but what I could imagine as being not part of this middle class sensibility is, for example, a Muslim novel about women who prefer to dress very modestly, or a Chinese novel in favor of censorship and in favor of a more authoritarian government. Like, these are the types of books that are missing from world literature as I see it. And I think that it may be because in order to be relatable to a global audience, certain edges have to be dulled. And that dulling of edges deprives readers of something, but I don't know if it's something that they would choose even if they were given the option.
Purely based on speculation, I think if there is some kind of recentering of values away from liberal democracies to maybe a more China-centric model of authoritarianism, if there was a shift in the global audience, in what we come to expect, then maybe it would allow for more diverse voices. But I also think that these voices are already present, but they are not accessible to us as readers of English. Like whether or not that's global, I think, we can maybe define it as such. But if a book exists in Chinese and it's read by, like 500 million Chinese people, but it's not translated into English, it's obviously limited in scope. It's not global, but it's still read by a significant amount of people.
I think that's what I mean specifically when I talk about a world literature. Like, it's not just a homegrown for us by us sort of literary production, but something that is read and appreciated deliberately on a globalized scale. I think that we can see this a lot in the difference between modern Japanese literature and modern Chinese literature, where Japanese literature has already attained that level and Chinese literature is still trying to attain that level. I think that there is a difference in sensibility, to be sure, from different countries, but I think that in general, when a country's literature has reached this level, certain edges are removed just because of the audience that is expected and the expectations that that audience has.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I don't know if it's a removal of edges. It's a sifting in my mind. It's not that it's removed, but it's sifted. Works that don't seem to cohere to what is expected by the global audience, they just don't gain traction.
So this is something that I've talked about on Reddit quite a bit recently, actually, is whether literature and novels in general are really the scene for working through ideas. And I think Sam and I, we had discussed this a bit. I really don't think that it's possible nowadays for novels to be a place for working through ideas because of this sifting.
Because you think the global market is kind of self-selecting for a certain type of sensibility, certain values.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is that people who write are often middle class, and people who read are often middle class, and people who read books from other countries want to read relatable books. So we're not going to see the novel from another country that challenges our religious ideals, and we're not going to see a book from another country that challenges our ideas of government, because those books are left on the shelf, even if they make it to the shelf in the first place.
Do you think it's only about topic, or do you think there's also, I don't want to be super presumptuous here, but in working through this question, I keep thinking about pro-establishment things that I've seen, like especially with movies. And I know the book market is different from the film industry, but pro-establishment movies usually aren't very nuanced, at least the ones that I've seen. There are some out there that do well. I can think of some Chinese ones and some American ones that have been nationalistic and pro-establishment, and some of them do well, but I feel like that is this very small minority, and that's not because there isn't an audience for it. I think it's more because either the people working on those don't have that nuanced feel or something else. It comes down to artfulness and artlessness, but I don't know if that can be said across the board, and I don't know if it's the same thing with literature.
I don't think that radical literature is impossible in world literature. I think based on books that we've read books that might be considered somewhat radical, like Blindness, for example, which won was it the Pulitzer?
He won a Nobel Prize.
A Nobel Prize. Yeah, and it was a bestseller. I mean, if you talk about movies, you had not very recently, but V for Vendetta was kind of an anarchist movie and it was really popular. The Matrix was really popular. I mean, those are not books or movies that uphold the status quo. I don't know if we want to talk about these works specifically, but I think generally these revolutionary or radical texts are present, but the problem is that the vast majority of people are not radicals, right? By the very definition of radical, they are not radical, because if they were radical, it wouldn't be radical, right? So you already have a very limited number of people who are radical, who are producing radical works. It's not like it's impossible to find these works, but rather that the kind of people who hold that sensibility are limited. So, because of that, then the work that gets consumed tend to uphold the status quo. But I don't think it's impossible.
James, in the past couple of episodes, you had mentioned that people who are reading novels from other countries often have a sense of tourism. You had mentioned that when we read Stay With Me, you read this novel because you want to see something from a different place that's different from your own life. Did you actually feel that when you're reading these novels? Because I actually didn't feel it very much.
Yes and no. I think in Americana, there certainly is some pleasure derived from reading about Nigeria and reading about how the customs are different. So, yes, in some ways, yeah. But I guess I'll just say that there is a difference in that I've traveled quite a bit, and both of you have as well internationally. I think there's a difference between people who travel internationally and people who have never traveled internationally. Our perspective is different. Like the way we understand cultural differences is different from someone who's never traveled internationally.
Sure. So how do you relate that to what you just
It
said
doesn't
here?
shock us as
Well,
much as it would somebody who hasn't, I guess.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, someone,
Gotcha.
for example, if someone does not regularly travel internationally or has never traveled internationally, reads a book with Nigerian English, they might find that exciting. Whereas
Mm.
for me, I don't think it's necessarily exciting. Sometimes it might just be annoying, Like it adds local color. But I think someone who's reading a book from a different culture because they want to be a cultural tourist, they would find that interesting and new and fresh. Whereas if you've traveled extensively abroad, you probably, at some point think it's great that these people are speaking different languages, but man, like I just want to communicate. So that I think is like the kind of cultural tourism that I would describe, as well as you read about someone who's actually very successful in Nigeria. Once again, it's DCA's The Problem of the Single Story. I think people who travel internationally, they have generally a broader perspective. Like they probably have met people from Nigeria and they understand that not everyone is the same, I would hope, from having that broader perspective. Whereas if you don't have that broader perspective, you might just assume certain things about countries and people. But is this related to your global middle class question?
Well, I think the relation is that I didn't feel this sort of sense of tourism when I was reading these novels because I think that the efforts were made by all three novelists to show that Nigeria, in fact, is not so different from other places in the world. And the lives of middle class people in Nigeria are very similar to the lives of middle class people everywhere. I think that there is a push and momentum pushing them towards kind of sameness that I think detracts from that sense of cultural tourism.
Yeah, I think when they talk about certain things happening, like the market burning down in the death of Vivek Oji, or protests and what else was happening?
Coups, all the different coups.
Coups, yeah, in Americana especially. We get a little bit of that, but it's very clear that that's not the focus. So I want to redirect us a little bit and bring us back to when we were discussing Austerlitz a couple months ago. James asked whether that book offers any kind of prescriptive solution to the collective trauma that it was discussing. I want to do the same with these books and with shame. I think shame figures into all three of these books, but especially with The Death of Vivek Oji and Stay With Me. Especially the men in those two books seem to be shrouded in this kind of shame about their flaws. But for the most part, I think it's only presented as an issue without a solution. So even if a solution is suggested, the men choose largely to ignore the issues at hand. In fact, I think violence is often a catalyst for change, but I don't think that is supposed to be the desired takeaway. Do you think these books offer any sort of solution or anything of the sort for the issues that they raise? Or are they merely raising awareness?
I read it as more severe than raising awareness. I think it's an indictment of the patriarchal society that all three writers have lived in.
I would agree.
I think all three writers are feminists. And I think part of that indictment is they're not just showing how things are different for women and trans people, but they're also showing how it's difficult for men who are caught up in this patriarchal society.
I think that there is a palpable anger in all three novels. I think that it's never explicitly focused on these men. So I don't think that solving this kind of crisis, this shameful behavior, is the focus of the novels. So I'm just wondering if there would really be any sort of desire to solve these problems from the point of the reader or from the point of the writer.
I guess what I'm wondering is, are they advocating for anything, or are they just advocating for change in general?
I think that Adichie stands out here because I think, unlike the other two novelists, Adichie really does have a political perspective and something specific that she's pointing towards. I've said before that I think that Obinze is her ideal role model for Nigerian manhood. He doesn't solve the problems that the other male characters face in that novel, but he does stand as a role model for the readers. So in that sense, I do think that there is a specific method of change being offered.
And what about Amedzi's belief or understanding of the world as one composed of multiple realities?
I mean, I don't want to give too much of my personal opinion here, but I do think it's basically kind of incoherent. Like when they say that, I don't know what it really means in terms of actual policy or actual life.
To me, that seems less about policy and more about a general acceptance of other people, rather than resorting to violence or rather than denying people existence. But I see what you mean, that it is a little murky, but I don't think their goals with that book are the same as they might be. Caveat, I haven't read it, but I get the sense that Freshwater has different goals than The Death of Vivek Oji.
Let me ask a question that's a little bit different here. Maybe it's a reframing of this. Do you see these three books in contention with each other over some kind of idea? Are they all saying the same thing, which is this kind of feminist call to change against the patriarchy? Or do you see any kinds of differences between how these books stand in relation to each other?
I do think, as I had said, that all three are very middle class, but I think that the one place where we do find difference is on gender politics when it comes to Emedzi and Adichie, in that this is a very specific concern for Emedzi and perhaps more of a generalized concern for Adichie. Whereas Adichie, I think, is rather conservative and kind of bland in terms of her politics when it comes to sex and gender. I think that Emedzi would rather have much greater openness in terms of roles and in terms of acceptance in Nigerian society. Emedzi would probably be the type of person to argue in favor of like polyamorous, non-monogamous relationships, non-binary bathrooms, all sorts of different sort of gender politics topics. And I think Adichie would just say, just treat women well, and that's enough.
In Stay With Me, I think we see a lot more anger and a lot more disgust being used as a point of view, whereas Americana is more about love and more about just being happy with what you have rather than trying to change things.
I think you do see a spectrum, and that's interesting to me. And you see the backdrop of why that's needed. You see the patriarchy, and that's interesting to me. Beyond gender politics, I'm not sure we see anything else. I don't think, for example, we see any indictment, as we mentioned before, of like liberal democracy. I don't think we see much of religion.
Yeah.
Right? Is there anything else besides gender politics?
We see religion lightly scorned
Yeah, when Vivek is beaten during the exorcism, when they're trying to get rid of his spirits, I guess you would call it, that is critical. And I think that in general, Emetsi has more negative things to say about Nigerian society, but not all of them are as elaborated as their gender politics are.
I think that's the same with Adebayo, too. We do see indictments about religious practices in that, too, but again, they aren't as central as the more generalized feminist point of view.
Yeah, I think broadly we could say all three writers are against tradition, whatever that is in these different books, because in these books they stand for different things.
Well, certainly blindly following tradition, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think that's specific enough for us to really grapple with and say that this book is contending with this idea, right?
Yeah, I think Stay With Me comes closest to trying to pit, for lack of better terms, tradition versus modernity. But as we discussed in the last episode, those aren't quite the right terms. But while you could make that point for all of these books, I don't think any of them are that flatly about that.
Let's contrast for a moment. I think if we look back on our Japanese fiction series, when I read those novels, I have the sense that Japan is the world. In the eyes of those authors, Japan is the entire world. Whereas when I read these Nigerian novels, I always feel like Nigeria has an other. There's always an outside to go to or to come from. And I think that that lack of centrality is important. I think that it means something. I'm not entirely sure what it means, but it could be related to this kind of middle class insecurity that they feel like they're not at that level where they could say Nigeria is enough.
I agree with you, but I also wonder if that's something particular to either East Asia or Japan specifically. Because I would say the same for China and the books we read in Chinese science fiction.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Three Body? I mean, Three Body was very Sinocentric.
Vagabonds definitely had an other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, though we did talk about how it was an other framed by Chinese sensibilities.
Right. It may be an Asian thing because I do feel like there is a tendency in Asian thought to think of the differences between Asian and non Asian as very large and perhaps insurmountable. Whereas I think in Western thought, we do think that cultural differences are not so exclusionary and basically anybody can relate to anybody else.
Well, it sounds to me like we just want to read more Asian novels because we've gone from Nigerian fiction to Japanese fiction and even vagabonds.
We can't get away from vagabonds, though.
We better take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about if we want to read more Nigerian fiction. The answer might surprise you. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, more Nigerian fiction?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know about these writers specifically, though I think I will keep an eye on them. But I think I do want to read from other Nigerian writers.
I will say more to Adichie. I think I've seen enough from Emetsi, and I think Adebayo is okay, but I'm not particularly interested. I think that I don't have enough time to keep up with every writer, so she's one of those that I may let slide.
I I guess I'll say no, because, like, what's going on with Chad?
Sure.
Yeah, I just feel like, given our limited time, I am really curious. Like, okay, South African fiction has a big presence in English, and the only thing I've read is, and I don't remember, my memory is really bad today, the one about the professor who got into trouble because of a scandal.
Disgrace.
Disgrace, yeah. So besides Disgrace, like, I think I've read a couple of short stories from South Africa, and that's it. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like, what about these other countries in this massive landmass? Like, what are they up to?
I mean, what if the answer was not much? I think, to be honest, the answer for a lot of these other places is not much because you have to get to this middle class status before you produce a lot of things that other people are interested in.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to write a novel if you're in South Sudan right now or
Yeah.
Somalia. But South Africa, maybe. I'm sure there's good stuff happening in South Africa. So I don't know. I mean, yes and no. Like, I would like to read some Adichie, but even though I really did like Americana, I'm just curious about other countries now. I'd like to go to, let's say, Brazil, for example, or just another country that's producing new and exciting work.
Yeah, I think that if you continue to think of it as, oh, I'm reading Nigerian fiction rather than I'm reading Emedzi or I'm reading Adebayo, you do have a limited perspective. I don't think that there is anything particularly Nigerian here that I can see, but maybe I'm missing something.
So I've mentioned a few times today about how, we've got a limited sample of Nigerian literature, despite me just saying that I probably don't want to read more Nigerian fiction. Um, do you have any unanswered questions from the series? Is there anything you want to know more about, either in regards to Nigerian fiction or about Nigeria?
Well, one thing that we do have as a limiting factor with these is, as you pointed out, a kind of generalized feminist viewpoint. We have two women and a non binary writer. So we don't have a male perspective here. So, what are the men writing about currently? Even though these books are different, they are advocating for somewhat similar things. I find it hard to believe that this is all that's being talked about there.
And even though I don't know this for a fact because I didn't look it up, but I feel like these three writers are all geographically close to each other.
Like mostly all in Lagos, or
Yeah. So I wonder, if it wasn't so centered on Lagos, what that kind of fiction might be like. Though Stay With Me, I guess, wasn't, right? They go to Lagos, but it's not set in Lagos.
I would like to see more about the ethnic differences and the religious differences in Nigeria because it is this very multicultural, multi ethnic society, how that plays out. But I'm not sure if I want to see that in fiction because I think that this could be something better addressed through documentary film or just another type of media. I don't know if it's an academic interest or an artistic interest.
This is becoming an EAD meme now. Like, you've got to be doing this on purpose, where
What?
where in response to the question, it's like, I don't want to read more about this. Make this into a movie. Moving images, that's what I want.
I mean, when you want to learn about Nigeria, do you have to do it through reading a novel?
No, you don't have to. You can look at a National Geographic article.
Yeah.
All right, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we'll begin our climate fiction series, Apocalypse Soon, with Lydia Millet's A Children's Bible. We've got an updated reading schedule that's on Reddit at Canonical Pod. We also post threads for our book club discussion every Friday on our subreddit. If you'd like to talk about Nigerian fiction, you can find us there. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you enjoy this podcast, you can leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That really helps us grow the community. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.